I quit my job to care for my mute father-in-law for a year. Then I heard him laughing on the phone at 3 a.m. The laugh cut through the silence of my house at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday in November. Not a quiet chuckle or a muffled sound. A full, belly-deep laugh that echoed from the downstairs guest room where my father-in-law lived, where my supposedly mute father-in-law had lived for the past 13 months without speaking a single word. I sat up in bed so fast the room spun. My husband Ethan was in Detroit for a work conference, wouldn't be back until Saturday, which meant it was just me and Robert in the house. Robert, who hadn't spoken since his stroke 15 months ago. Robert, who communicated through a whiteboard and frustrated hand gestures. Robert, who I'd quit my job to care for full-time because he needed someone who understood his needs and could be patient with his condition. I pressed my hands against my chest and felt my heart trying to punch its way out through my ribs. The laugh came again, rich and genuine, followed by words I couldn't quite make out but unmistakably belonged to a man who could speak perfectly fine. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed in the t-shirt and shorts I slept in. My bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floor as I moved down the hallway. The house was dark except for a thin line of light under Robert's door. I stood outside that door for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, listening. No, she has no idea, Robert's voice said clearly through the door. His voice. The voice I'd never heard in over a year of living with him. She's completely clueless. Ethan was right about her. Sweet, but not very bright. I'd been working as a project manager at a tech startup for 6 years when Robert had his stroke. The company was small but growing, and I'd just been promoted to lead a major client account worth $2.3 million annually. I loved my job. I was good at it. My team respected me, and I'd finally reached the salary level where Ethan and I could start seriously saving for a house instead of renting our cramped 2-bedroom apartment downtown. Then Ethan got the call from the hospital on a Monday morning in October, 15 months ago. His voice had cracked when he told me his dad had collapsed at home. By the time we got to the hospital, Robert was conscious but couldn't speak. The doctor said he'd had an ischemic stroke affecting the language centers of his brain. They used terms like Broca's aphasia and said it was unclear if he'd ever regain his speech. Robert was 61 years old, divorced from Ethan's mother for over a decade, and lived alone in a small house across town. The doctors said he'd need months of rehabilitation and round-the-clock care initially. They recommended a rehabilitation facility or hiring a full-time home health aide. Ethan had looked at me across Robert's hospital bed with tears in his eyes and asked if there was any way we could do it ourselves. He said his dad would be so much more comfortable with family that strangers would just stress him out and slow his recovery. He said Robert had always been private and independent, and being in a facility would break his spirit completely. I'd held Ethan's hand and said we'd figure it out together. I'd suggested splitting the caregiving duties, maybe hiring someone part-time to help. Ethan had pointed out that I worked from home 2 days a week anyway, while he had to be in the office every day for his sales job. He'd said it made more sense for me to take the lead on Robert's care. Then he'd added the thing that made me say yes. He'd said his dad had always liked me better than any of Ethan's previous girlfriends, that Robert had told him I was the one he should marry. He'd said Robert deserved to have someone who actually cared about him taking care of him during the hardest time of his life. Robert moved into our guest room 3 weeks after the stroke. The room was small, barely big enough for the hospital bed we'd rented, and the physical therapy equipment the occupational therapist had recommended. I'd painted it a warm beige and hung cheerful landscape prints on the walls to make it feel less institutional. Robert had seemed grateful when we wheeled him in, his eyes welling up as he squeezed my hand in what I interpreted as thanks. He couldn't speak, but he could write on a whiteboard we kept by his bed. His handwriting was shaky and hard to read at first, but I learned to decipher it. The first thing he wrote to me was, "Thank you for everything." I'd cried and hugged him and told him we were family, that this was what family did for each other. I quit my job 6 weeks after Robert moved in. The demands of full-time caregiving made it impossible to focus on work. Robert needed help with everything: bathing, dressing, eating, physical therapy exercises 3 times a day, medications at specific times, doctor's appointments twice a week, speech therapy sessions that went nowhere because he couldn't produce any sounds beyond frustrated grunts. My boss had been understanding at first, letting me work reduced hours and take calls from home. But after the 3rd missed deadline and the 2nd client complaint about my unavailability, she'd sat me down and explained I needed to decide between my job and my caregiving responsibilities. Ethan had encouraged me to choose Robert. He'd said his sales job paid enough to cover our expenses, that we could tighten our budget for a while, that Robert's care was temporary, and I could find another project management job later once he'd recovered. He'd reminded me that Robert had no one else, that Ethan's 2 siblings lived out of state and barely called, that I was the only person who could help. So I'd submitted my resignation letter and become a full-time caregiver at age 31, watching my career disappear while I learned how to adjust a shower chair and puree solid foods into liquids Robert could swallow without choking. The daily routine consumed my entire existence within a month. Wake at 6 a.m. to help Robert use the bedside commode because he couldn't walk to the bathroom yet. Change his bedding if he'd had an accident during the night, which happened more often than I wanted to acknowledge. Help him wash up with a basin of warm water and a washcloth because he found showers exhausting. Get him dressed in the elastic waist pants and loose shirts that were easier to manage than his old clothes. Prepare his breakfast, which had to be soft foods that wouldn't require much chewing. Feed him because his right hand still had limited mobility, and he'd spill otherwise. Give him his morning medications, all 5 pills that had to be taken with food. Then the physical therapy exercises, arm raises, leg lifts, sitting to standing transfers, walking practice with the walker. Every movement was slow and painful to watch as Robert struggled to rebuild strength his body had lost. His face would contort with effort and frustration, and I'd offer encouragement while my own back ached from supporting his weight during transfers. Speech therapy came twice a week, but it was pointless. The therapist, a kind woman named Grace Pemberton who'd been practicing for 12 years, would come and try to get Robert to make sounds, to move his mouth, to do facial exercises that were supposed to help. Robert would try so hard, his face turning red with effort, but no sounds came out except those frustrated grunts. Grace kept saying it was early days, that recovery from this type of aphasia could take years, that we shouldn't give up hope. But I could see the disappointment in Robert's eyes every session when he couldn't produce even a simple ah sound. I'd rub his shoulder after Grace left and tell him it was okay, that we'd find other ways to communicate, that he was doing great with the whiteboard. The isolation crept up on me so gradually I didn't notice it was happening until I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone except Ethan, Robert, and medical professionals in 3 months. My friends had stopped calling after I'd canceled plans 6 times in a row because Robert needed me or I was too exhausted to socialize. My parents lived in Arizona and called weekly, but the conversations were strained because I had nothing to talk about except caregiving duties, and my mother kept suggesting maybe it was time to look into professional help. Ethan worked long hours, often leaving at 7 a.m. and not returning until 8 o'clock or 9 p.m. He'd come home exhausted and want to relax, not hear about the challenges of my day. When I tried to tell him how hard things were, he'd remind me that he was working 60-hour weeks to support us financially, that we were both making sacrifices, that his dad would get better eventually, and this situation was temporary. He'd started staying late at the office more frequently, saying he needed to close deals and couldn't leave early just because I was having a hard day. By the 6-month mark, I felt like I'd ceased to exist as a person and become just a function. The woman who fed Robert. The woman who helped Robert to the bathroom. The woman who called doctors and picked up prescriptions and did therapeutic exercises. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something for myself. Couldn't remember the last time I'd read a book or watched a movie or had a conversation about anything other than medical care. Ethan had started making comments about my appearance, pointing out that I'd gained weight from stress eating and not exercising, suggesting maybe I should try harder to take care of myself. He said it lovingly, framing it as concern for my well-being, but it felt like one more way I was failing at everything. Then, around the 8-month mark, something shifted. Robert seemed to be improving physically. He could walk short distances with just a cane instead of the walker. He could feed himself breakfast if I cut everything into small pieces. He could get himself to the bathroom during the day with me just supervising rather than fully assisting. Grace said his motor skills were recovering better than his speech, which sometimes happened with this type of brain injury. She suggested we focus more on alternative communication methods rather than hoping his speech would return. She taught us some basic sign language and encouraged Robert to keep using the whiteboard, but she also gently prepared us for the possibility that he might never speak again. That news had devastated Ethan. He'd pulled me aside after Grace left and said he felt like he was losing his dad, even though Robert was physically right there. He said the man who taught him to play baseball and given him advice about life couldn't even tell him he loved him anymore. He'd cried in my arms, and I'd felt guilty for every moment I'd resented the situation. This was his father, his only parent who'd been actively involved in his life. Of course, he was struggling with grief. I needed to be more understanding and stop being so selfish about my own needs. But then the small things started not adding up. Little details that didn't quite make sense but that I explained away because questioning them felt wrong. Like the way Robert's hand would sometimes move smoothly and precisely when he thought I wasn't watching, then become shaky and uncertain the moment he knew I could see him. Or how he could write complex thoughts on his whiteboard but claimed he couldn't make any sounds, when the speech therapist said those two skills typically correlated. Or the way his facial muscles seemed perfectly fine for eating and drinking, but apparently couldn't form words according to every medical professional who examined him. The first time I really noticed something was off came during a doctor's appointment about 10 months after the stroke. We were seeing Dr. Neil Ashford, a neurologist who'd been following Robert's case since the beginning. Dr. Ashford had been reviewing Robert's latest MRI and comparing it to the one taken right after the stroke. He'd said something about how the damage to Robert's brain had healed remarkably well, better than he'd expected given the initial presentation. He'd said he was actually surprised Robert hadn't regained any speech function, given how much the affected areas had recovered. He'd looked at Robert and asked him directly to try making any sound, even just humming or clearing his throat. Robert had tried, his face scrunching up with apparent effort, but nothing came out. Dr. Ashford had frowned slightly and made a note in Robert's chart. After we left, I'd asked Robert on the whiteboard if he could maybe try humming at home, just to see if something might work in a less stressful environment. He'd written back, tried many times, nothing works, very frustrating. I'd felt guilty for questioning him and let it drop, but the doubt had planted itself in my mind like a seed. A week later, I was doing laundry in the basement and I thought I heard a cough from upstairs. Not Robert's usual clearing throat sound, but a real, full cough. I'd rushed upstairs and found Robert sitting in his recliner watching television, looking perfectly normal. I'd asked if he was okay, if he'd coughed. He'd looked confused and shaken his head no, then written "why" on his whiteboard. I'd said I thought I heard something and he'd written "TV maybe." I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it or heard something from the television. But I started paying more attention after that. Started really watching Robert when he didn't know I was watching. Started noticing little inconsistencies that my exhausted brain had been too tired to catch before. His breathing patterns changed depending on whether he knew I was in the room. When he thought I was busy elsewhere, his breathing was normal and regular. But when I was directly caring for him, he'd often breathe in this labored, strained way that seemed performative. His physical therapy exercises showed the same pattern. He'd struggle with movements when Grace or I were supervising, but I'd catch him moving more fluidly when he was alone and thought no one was paying attention. Once I walked into his room unexpectedly and saw him reach for his water glass on the nightstand with his supposedly weak right hand, moving smoothly and confidently. The instant he noticed me, his hand began to shake and he fumbled the glass, spilling water on himself. I'd rushed over to help and he'd written "stupid weak hand" on his whiteboard with frustration. But I'd seen what I'd seen. The smooth, coordinated movement before he knew I was there. When I'd mentioned these observations to Ethan, he'd looked at me like I'd grown a second head. He'd asked if I was seriously suggesting his dad was faking symptoms of a brain injury. When I'd said no, I just thought maybe Robert was recovering more than we realized, and we should reassess his care needs, Ethan had gotten defensive. He'd said I clearly didn't understand how brain injuries worked, that recovery wasn't linear, that of course Robert would have good moments and bad moments. He'd suggested I was looking for reasons to stop caring for his dad because I was tired and wanted my old life back. That accusation had stung because it was partially true. I did want my old life back. I did miss working and having friends and being a person instead of just a caregiver, but that didn't mean my observations were wrong. I'd started documenting what I noticed after that conversation. Nothing elaborate, just notes in my phone about times and dates and specific things that seemed inconsistent with Robert's diagnosis. The time I heard what sounded like whistling coming from his room, but when I'd gone to check, he'd been reading silently and claimed he hadn't made any noise. The time his physical therapist commented that Robert's muscle tone was better than expected for someone who'd been as immobile as he supposedly was, almost like he'd been exercising more than the prescribed routines. The time I'd found his whiteboard markers arranged in a specific pattern on his nightstand, spelling out letters that made no sense, like he'd been practicing writing then scrambled the evidence when he'd heard me coming. Small things. Easily explainable things. But they kept accumulating in my notes until I had a list of 23 separate incidents over the course of 6 weeks. I'd shown the list to Ethan one night after dinner, thinking maybe if I presented it clearly and logically, he'd at least consider that something wasn't right. Instead, he'd read through it and then asked me point blank if I was having some kind of breakdown. He'd said the list made me sound paranoid and obsessive. He'd said caregiving stress could cause psychological issues if left unaddressed. He'd suggested I needed to see a therapist, that maybe I was experiencing caregiver burnout or depression. He'd said this with concern in his voice, like he was worried about my mental health, but underneath I could hear something else. Dismissal, disbelief, a certainty that I was wrong and he was right. That conversation had happened 3 weeks before I heard Robert laughing on the phone. 3 weeks of me questioning my own sanity and wondering if Ethan was right, if I was losing my grip on reality because I was so exhausted and isolated. 3 weeks of continuing to care for Robert while secretly watching him more carefully, trying to catch something definitive that would prove I wasn't crazy. And then, at 3:17 a.m. on that Thursday in November, I heard my mute father-in-law laughing and speaking clearly on the phone in his room. I stood outside his door with my hand pressed over my mouth to keep from making any sound. My whole body was shaking. The voice on the other end of the phone was too quiet for me to hear, but Robert's responses came through clearly. "She's sleeping upstairs," he said. "Ethan's in Detroit until Saturday. Perfect timing to finalize everything. No, she won't figure it out. She's been completely docile this whole time. Hasn't questioned anything seriously. Yeah, the house closes escrow next week. Once we get her signature on the refinance papers, we'll have access to the equity and she'll be on the hook for the debt. I know it's taken longer than we planned, but this way is cleaner. No suspicion of coercion if she thinks she's helping out the family." My knees actually buckled. I had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. They were talking about refinancing my house, the house I'd bought before I met Ethan, the one thing I owned outright that had any real value. The house I'd put both our names on after we got married because Ethan had said marriage meant sharing everything equally. I crept back upstairs to the bedroom on legs that didn't feel like they belonged to me. My hands shook so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I opened my banking app with fingers that felt numb and frozen. The house account we'd set up for shared expenses showed a balance of $127.43. That was wrong. There should have been almost $4,000 in that account from my savings and Ethan's recent paychecks. I checked the transaction history. 3 large withdrawals over the past 2 weeks, each one labeled home improvement or medical expenses in the notes. $1,800, $1,200, $950. I hadn't made any of those withdrawals, which meant Ethan had been pulling money out without telling me. I opened my email and searched for anything about refinancing. Found 3 unread emails from a mortgage broker named Stephen Kovach with my name on them, sent to an email address I didn't recognize. The subject line said things like, refinance application, and next steps for your home equity loan. Someone had been corresponding with this broker pretending to be me. I took screenshots of everything with shaking hands, the emails, the bank statements, the transaction history. I saved them all to a cloud drive and texted them to my own sister Lisa, who lived in Seattle. Added a message. Something's really wrong. If anything happens to me, you need to see these. Lisa called me immediately, even though it was 3:43 a.m. What the hell is going on? She asked, her voice sharp with worry. I told her everything. The laugh I'd heard, the conversation about refinancing, the missing money, the emails I'd never sent. My voice kept breaking as I talked, tears running down my face silently. Lisa listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she said, you need to get out of that house right now. Pack a bag and leave. Come to Seattle. Tonight. I told her I couldn't just leave. I needed proof. I needed to understand what was really happening. Lisa said I had enough proof already, that I was in danger, that I needed to prioritize my safety. But I couldn't walk away without knowing the full truth. I'd given up a year of my life to care for Robert. I'd sacrificed my career and my friendships and my sense of self. I deserved to know exactly what they'd done to me and why. I waited until I heard Robert's light click off around 4 a.m., then I crept back downstairs and slipped into his room with my phone recording video. The screen light was off so it wouldn't alert him, but the audio would capture anything he said. I pretended I was checking on him like I sometimes did during the night. Robert? I whispered. Are you okay? I thought I heard something. He didn't respond. Just lay there breathing heavily like he was deeply asleep. I stood in that doorway for a full minute, recording the silence, recording him pretending. Then I backed out and closed the door. I spent the rest of the night in the guest bathroom going through Ethan's emails on my laptop. I had his password because we'd shared everything when we got married, had made a point of having total transparency in our relationship. Apparently that transparency had only gone one direction. I found email chains with Robert going back 9 months, discussions about the best way to access my assets, debates about whether to forge my signature on refinance documents or try to get me to sign them voluntarily, calculations of how much they could pull out of my house before I noticed, plans for what they'd do with the money once they had it. And underneath all that, the cruelest part, discussions about how easy I was to manipulate. She's so desperate to be a good wife and daughter-in-law, Ethan had written in one email. She'll believe whatever we tell her as long as we frame it as family responsibility. Robert had responded, the Mute Act is perfect. She can't question what I'm not saying. And you were right about making her quit her job. Now she's completely dependent on you financially and emotionally. She's trapped. I read those emails in the darkness of the guest bathroom while my marriage and my reality crumbled around me. They'd planned this. Maybe not from the very beginning, but at least since before Robert moved in. The stroke had been real, according to the medical records I found, but Robert had recovered his speech months ago and chosen to keep pretending because it served their purpose. They'd turned me into an unpaid nurse and isolated me from everyone who might have noticed what was happening. They'd made me doubt my own observations and call myself crazy. They'd been systematically stealing my financial security while I literally wiped Robert's ass and told myself I was doing the right thing. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was cold and sharp and clarifying. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't questioning my sanity. I knew exactly what they'd done, and I was going to make sure everyone else knew it too. I called my sister back at 5:30 a.m. and told her I needed the name of the best fraud attorney she knew. Lisa worked in corporate law and had connections. She gave me 3 names within 5 minutes, lawyers who specialized in financial elder abuse and fraud cases, even though this was the reverse situation. The first attorney I called, Monica Reeves, with 16 years of experience in fraud litigation, answered at 8 a.m. when her office opened. I explained everything in a rush. The fake mutism, the stolen money, the refinance scheme, the emails. Monica listened carefully, and then asked me to send her every piece of documentation I had. This is fraud, potentially identity theft, and conspiracy, she said. You need to freeze all your accounts immediately and file a police report today. Don't tip them off that you know. Just act normal until we have all the evidence secured and law enforcement involved. Normal. I had to act normal while knowing my husband and father-in-law had spent a year systematically destroying my life. I went downstairs at 7 a.m., like always, and started making Robert's breakfast. Oatmeal with mashed banana, the way he liked it. Decaf coffee with exactly 1 sugar. I brought it to his room on the tray and helped him sit up in bed, just like I'd done every morning for 13 months. He smiled at me gratefully and squeezed my hand. Wrote, "You're so good to me," on his whiteboard. I smiled back and said, "Family takes care of family," managing to keep my voice steady. Then I went upstairs and called the fraud department at my bank. Froze my accounts. Changed all my passwords. Set up alerts for any new activity. The representative asked if I wanted to file a fraud report, and I said yes. My husband had been making unauthorized withdrawals. She was sympathetic and efficient, walking me through every step. By 10 a.m., Ethan had no access to my money anymore. I called the mortgage broker, Stephen Kovach, and told him I'd never authorized any refinance application. He was confused at first, then concerned when I explained someone had been impersonating me. He said he'd put a hold on the application immediately and report the attempted fraud. By 11 a.m., their refinance scheme was dead. Then I went to the police station and filed a formal report with Detective Marcus Reyna, who'd worked financial crimes for 9 years. I brought everything: the screenshots, the emails, the bank statements, the recording from Robert's room. Detective Reyna listened to the recording of Robert speaking clearly on the phone, and his expression went from interested to angry. "This is elder abuse in reverse," he said. "Or really, it's spousal financial abuse using a fake medical condition as cover. I've honestly never seen anything quite like this." He said they'd need to investigate, that it would take time to build a case, but that I had more than enough evidence to get started. He asked if I felt safe in my home. I said I didn't know. He suggested I might want to stay somewhere else, at least until they'd interviewed Ethan and Robert. I told him Ethan was out of town until Saturday, that I had time to figure out my next move. What I didn't tell him was that I wanted to be there when Ethan came home. I wanted to see his face when he realized I knew everything. Detective Reyna gave me his card and told me to call if anything felt unsafe. Then I went home and continued my normal routine. Fed Robert lunch, did his exercises, chatted about nothing while he wrote responses on his whiteboard. The whole time I was screaming inside, but my face stayed calm and pleasant. That night, I heard Robert on the phone again around 2 a.m. This time I recorded video from outside his door, audio turned up to catch every word. He was talking to Ethan in Detroit. "She's acting completely normal," Robert said. "I don't think she heard anything last night. We're still good to go. Just get her to sign the papers when you get home. Tell her it's to consolidate debt or refinance at a better rate. She'll do whatever you say." "I know. It's almost over. A few more weeks and we can drop this whole charade. I'm so sick of pretending to be helpless." I had him. Full video of him speaking, discussing their fraud scheme, planning my financial destruction. I sent it to Monica, to Detective Reyna, to my sister, to 3 separate cloud drives. This evidence was never disappearing. Friday passed in surreal slow motion. I went through all the motions of caregiving while my brain ran through scenarios of what would happen next. I called Monica twice to discuss the legal strategy. She said we could pursue criminal charges for fraud and identity theft, plus civil action to recover any money they'd already taken and get compensation for my year of unpaid labor. She said the video evidence of Robert speaking was devastating to any defense they might try to mount. "They're going to argue he recovered naturally and didn't tell anyone, but the emails planning this show clear intent to defraud," she explained. "Plus, the continuing to fake symptoms while actively stealing from you, that's going to destroy them in court." Friday night, I barely slept. Ethan's flight was supposed to land Saturday at 2 p.m. He'd texted that he'd be home by 4 o'clock. I had hours to prepare. I called Lisa and asked her to be on standby, ready to come get me if things got ugly. I called Detective Reyna and told him Ethan would be home Saturday afternoon, asked if he wanted to be there. He said he'd swing by around 5 o'clock to do a welfare check and ask some questions. Everything was in place. Saturday morning, I made Robert breakfast and helped him with his exercises like always. He had no idea I'd recorded him speaking, no idea the police were coming, no idea his entire scheme had collapsed around him while he slept. At 11 a.m., I packed a bag with essentials and put it in my car trunk, just in case I needed to leave quickly. At 1 o'clock, I positioned my phone on the bookshelf in the living room, recording everything. At 3:47, I heard Ethan's car pull into the driveway. He came through the door with his usual tired smile, dropping his bag and pulling me into a hug. "I missed you," he said into my hair. I hugged him back and said, "I missed you too," and felt nothing but cold rage. He went to see his dad first, the devoted son checking on his ailing father. I heard them talking quietly in Robert's room, heard Robert's silence and Ethan's one-sided conversation about his trip. Then Ethan came back upstairs and suggested we order dinner, maybe watch a movie together. I said that sounded nice. We sat on the couch and he pulled up a restaurant delivery app, scrolling through options. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said casually. "I talked to a mortgage broker about refinancing the house. With interest rates dropping, we could pull out some equity and pay off your student loans, maybe fix the roof. He just needs you to sign some papers. Should only take a minute." There it was, the moment they'd been working toward for a year. I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, asking me to sign away my financial security like it was nothing. "Sure," I said. "Let me see the papers." Ethan pulled out a folder from his work bag. The documents looked official, dense with legal language. I pretended to read through them while my heart pounded. "This seems like a lot of money to pull out," I said carefully. "Like way more than we'd need for student loans and a roof." Ethan shrugged. "Might as well get what we can while rates are good. We can invest the rest, build up savings again." "And I'd be responsible for this whole loan? My name only?" "Well, the house is in your name, so that's how it works. But we're married. What's yours is mine, right?" He said it with a smile, that same loving smile I'd fallen for 4 years ago. I set down the papers. "I'm not signing this." Ethan's smile froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know what you're doing. I know Robert can talk. I heard him. I recorded him. I know about the emails and the planning and all of it." The color drained from Ethan's face so fast I thought he might pass out. "Aurora, I don't know what you think you heard, but don't." My voice came out harder than I'd ever heard it. Don't lie to me anymore. I have recordings of Robert speaking. I have your emails discussing how to manipulate me. I have bank records of unauthorized withdrawals. I have everything. Ethan stood up from the couch, his hands moving in front of him like he was trying to physically push away my words. You're confused. The stress of caregiving has been affecting your judgment. We talked about this. Stop gaslighting me. I know what gaslighting is now. I know what you've been doing for a year. Robert's door opened downstairs. Footsteps. Normal walking footsteps came up the stairs. Robert appeared in the living room doorway, standing there on his own 2 feet without a cane, without any assistance. Looking at me with cold eyes that had nothing of the grateful patient in them. How much does she know? He asked Ethan. His voice was clear and strong, the voice I'd heard on the phone, the voice he'd had all along. I grabbed my phone from the bookshelf and held it up. I'm recording this. Everything you say right now is being recorded and automatically uploaded to the cloud. Both men froze. You're making a huge mistake, Robert said. Not wrote, said. Whatever you think is happening. I think you faked being mute for a year while I gave up my career to take care of you. I think you and Ethan planned to steal my house equity through a fraudulent refinance. I think you've been manipulating me and gaslighting me and stealing my money. And I think you're both going to prison for it. The doorbell rang. Detective Reyna, right on time. I kept my phone up and recording as I went to answer it. Detective Reyna, I said loudly for the recording. Thank you for coming to do that welfare check. Reyna came inside and took in the scene. Me with my phone up, Ethan pale and frozen on the couch, Robert standing on his own in the living room. Mr. Brennan, Reyna said, looking at Robert, I'm surprised to see you up and about. Your daughter-in-law's been telling me you lost the ability to walk and talk after your stroke. I've been recovering, Robert said carefully. It's been gradual. Then you won't mind answering some questions about phone calls you made at 3 a.m. Thursday discussing refinancing your daughter-in-law's house without her knowledge or consent? Robert's mouth snapped shut. Reyna looked at Ethan. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to need you to come to the station to answer questions about unauthorized withdrawals from joint accounts and potential identity fraud. I want a lawyer, Ethan said immediately. That's your right, but you're going to need to come with me either way. What happened after that was a blur of police stations and lawyer meetings and evidence documentation. Monica Reeves filed emergency motions to freeze all marital assets and get a restraining order keeping both men away from me and my property. Detective Reyna brought in a prosecutor who was fascinated by the case. This is financial abuse using fake medical incapacity as the mechanism of control, the prosecutor explained to me during one meeting. It's actually brilliant in how sick it is. They isolated you, made you dependent, destroyed your ability to work, positioned themselves to steal your assets, all while making you think you were being a good family member. The criminal charges came down within 2 weeks. Fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit theft, and financial exploitation. The prosecutor added a charge of elder abuse in reverse once she understood the full scope. Ethan tried to claim he'd been manipulated by Robert, that he hadn't understood what was happening, but the emails destroyed that defense. They showed months of planning, both men equally involved, both men celebrating each successful step toward draining my accounts. Robert's lawyer tried to argue he'd genuinely had the stroke and lost his speech, that he'd recovered naturally around month 6, but had been afraid to tell anyone because he'd grown comfortable being cared for. The recordings of him discussing the fraud scheme made that argument laughable. The civil case moved faster than the criminal one. Monica pursued it aggressively, seeking full ownership of the house for me, return of all stolen funds, compensation for my year of unpaid labor calculated at market rate for 24/7 home health care, and punitive damages. She also filed a malpractice report against the speech therapist for failing to properly assess whether Robert was capable of speech. Grace Pemberton was devastated when she learned the truth. She called me crying, apologizing for missing the deception. I told her it wasn't her fault. They fooled doctors and neurologists too. They fooled everyone. The house sale fell through when the title company discovered the fraud investigation. I got to stay in my home. The divorce papers went through in 6 months. Ethan fought me on everything out of pure spite, but Monica demolished him. The evidence was too overwhelming. He got nothing. Not the house, not my retirement accounts, not even splitting of assets we'd accumulated during marriage because the court ruled he'd been systematically defrauding me the entire time. Robert got 18 months in county jail plus 5 years probation. Could have been worse, but his lawyer managed to negotiate down from the initial charges. Ethan got 3 years in state prison. Monica said they got off light because white-collar crime sentencing was notoriously lenient, but that the convictions would follow them forever, making it nearly impossible to ever access credit or financial systems again. I went back to work 8 months after everything exploded. Not project management at a tech startup, but consulting work I could do on my own terms, setting my own hours and choosing my own clients. My old boss had heard what happened through the industry grapevine and reached out, offering to be a reference and introducing me to her network. Within 3 months, I was making more than I'd made at my old job. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Vance, who specialized in trauma recovery, helped me process the betrayal and manipulation. You're experiencing something similar to cult survivors, she explained during one session. You were isolated, made dependent, Had your reality systematically denied until you couldn't trust your own perceptions. That's not something you just get over. It's something you heal from slowly. The healing was slow. There were days I couldn't get out of bed because the shame of being fooled so completely was crushing. Days I wanted to call Ethan and ask him why. Why me? Why this? What had I done to deserve this? Dr. Vance said wanting answers from people incapable of giving honest ones was natural, but ultimately futile. They can't give you closure because they don't have it themselves. They're not self-aware enough to understand their own motivations beyond greed and entitlement. Lisa flew out from Seattle and stayed with me for a month during the worst of it. Having her there, someone who believed me from the start, who hadn't questioned my sanity, made an enormous difference. We'd stay up late talking, and she'd remind me of who I was before Ethan. The smart, successful woman who'd bought her own house and built her own career. That person didn't disappear, she said. She was just buried under abuse for a while, but she's still in there. 1 year after hearing Robert laugh on the phone, I was sitting in my living room drinking coffee and reading the news when I got a notification on my phone. The fraud victim support group I'd joined had posted about a new case that sounded similar to mine. Woman, husband, fake medical condition, financial control. The details were different, but the pattern was the same. I posted my story to the group. Within a week, I'd heard from 7 other people who'd experienced similar schemes. Not all with fake mutism, but with fake Alzheimer's, fake paralysis, fake seizure disorders, all used to isolate and financially abuse trusting family members. I started a blog documenting my experience and how I'd escaped. It went viral within a month. News outlets reached out asking to interview me. Suddenly, I was being asked to speak at conferences about financial fraud and domestic abuse. The story resonated because it was so unexpected. We think of elder abuse as younger people victimizing the elderly. No one talks about able-bodied older people faking incapacity to victimize their younger family members. But it happens. The stories in my inbox proved it happens more than anyone wants to acknowledge. I testified at a state hearing about financial fraud legislation. They were proposing new laws requiring additional verification for home refinances and equity withdrawals, better fraud detection at banks, more protections for people who'd been isolated from their financial accounts. My husband and his father stole a year of my life, I told the committee. They isolated me, destroyed my career, made me doubt my sanity, and tried to steal my home. And they almost succeeded because our financial systems have no safeguards against this kind of familial fraud. When fraud comes from inside your own marriage, from someone who has legal access to your accounts and your trust, the normal protections don't work. The legislation passed. They called it the Financial Coercion Prevention Act. Monica joked that it should have been called Aurora's Law, but I didn't want my name attached like that. The work itself was enough. Ethan sent me a letter from prison 16 months into his sentence. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. The letter was 3 pages long, typed on prison typewriter, full of excuses and justifications and attempts at apologizing without actually taking responsibility. I got caught up in my father's plan, he wrote. I know I should have stopped it, but I felt trapped. You have to understand, my dad was always so controlling and I couldn't figure out how to stand up to him. I read it once, then fed it into my shredder. Dr. Vance had warned me this would happen, that abusers often try to reframe themselves as victims once they face consequences. He wants you to absolve him, she'd said. He wants you to say it's okay. He had reasons. It wasn't really his fault. Don't give him that. I didn't. I never responded to the letter. Never gave him a chance to manipulate me again. Robert wrote too, a rambling 6-page letter claiming he'd had a complete psychological break after his stroke and hadn't been in his right mind during the fraud. I was traumatized by nearly dying, he wrote. I wasn't thinking clearly. I would never have hurt you intentionally. You were like a daughter to me. That letter went in the shredder too, even faster than Ethan's. 2 years after everything fell apart, I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. I had my career back, had friends again, had a life that belonged to me and no one else. I was dating someone new, another consultant I'd met through work. Nothing serious yet, but he was kind and honest and had his own life and interests beyond just what he could take from me. We'd talked about what happened with Ethan early on because I refused to hide it or pretend it didn't shape me. That's going to make it hard to trust people, he'd said. Are you okay with that? I'm learning to trust myself again, I'd told him. That's the part that matters. I still live in my house, the one my grandparents helped me buy, the one Ethan tried to steal. I repainted Robert's room and turned it into a real home office. Working there used to feel wrong, tainted by the year of lies, but my therapist suggested reclaiming the space as an act of healing. That room was stolen from you and used as a base of operations for your abuse, Dr. Vance said. Taking it back and making it yours again is powerful. She was right. Every morning I work in that room, I'm reminded that I survived, that I trusted my instincts even when everyone told me I was wrong, that I caught them, that I won. Sometimes I still wake up at 3:17 a.m., the exact time I first heard Robert's laugh. My body remembers even when my mind has processed and moved forward. On those nights, I get up and walk through my house, and remind myself that I'm safe now, that I'm not trapped, that no one is gaslighting me or stealing from me or pretending to be helpless while they plot my destruction. The fraud victims support group I started now has over 300 members. We meet monthly, virtually, and in person, sharing strategies and resources and stories. I listen to people describe their experiences and I recognize the patterns: the isolation, the reality denying, the weaponized trust. And I tell them the same thing Dr. Vance told me: you're not crazy. Your instincts were right, and you're going to survive this. Because that's the thing about people who fake vulnerability to exploit others. They underestimate the strength of the people they target. They think kindness equals weakness. They think compassion equals stupidity. Ethan and Robert thought I was sweet but not very bright. They thought I'd never figure it out, and even if I did, I'd be too broken down to do anything about it. They were wrong. I figured it out. I documented it. I exposed it. I prosecuted them. I took back my life. And now I help other people do the same. That's the real ending to this story. Not revenge, not even justice exactly. Just survival. Just reclaiming what was stolen and refusing to let them win. My father-in-law faked being mute for a year to steal my house and destroy my life. And I caught him laughing on the phone at 3 a.m. because predators always get sloppy eventually. They always believe their own superiority. They always underestimate their victims. And that's how they lose. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.